Oh, great. Thank you so much for inviting me and for organizing this. I'm going to share my screen so you can see some images associated with my talk here. What I'll be talking about today is a system of what I refer to as unfreedom in Northwest China that's targeted a group of Muslim people, most of them Uyghur, but also Kazakhs and Hui people, and really has changed their lives in many, many ways. I'll be talking about the sort of the introduction and first chapter of my book, which is coming out this fall. It's called Terror Capitalism. So if you're interested in this, you could read more about it when it arrives. It should be here in November. Just to sort of introduce the region and the general themes, in order to understand China, you have to understand the different sort of ethno-linguistic groups that are in China. It's not simply one group of people. The majority group, the Han people, live in the sort of darker green area. This is their ancestral homeland. They're indigenous to that space. But really significant portions of China are the ancestral homelands of other peoples. So there's Mongol peoples that live up here in the north. This is a place that's called Inner Mongolia in Chinese. It's called Neimong in Chinese. And then here in the southwest kind of corner of China is the Tibetan areas. Both of those groups are Buddhist groups, and both of them are indigenous to these spaces. They're more of a nomadic peoples or pastoral peoples, but they're located in these spaces. This is where their sacred lands are at. The Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples live up here in northwest China. This is the borderlands with Central Asia. There's around, let's say, 14 million or so Turkic Muslims, 12 million Uyghurs, and 1.5 million Kazakhs, and then there's Uzbeks and other groups. And that's really what I'll be focusing on in my talk, is this area up here. The sort of underlying tension that is at work here is that the large majority group, the Han peoples, which is 1.3 billion people, have over the last century or so moved into these areas in significant numbers, and that's caused a lot of tension between them and these other indigenous groups because they see themselves losing control over their own land, and so that's what I'll be discussing. The Uyghur region itself is the size of Alaska, and Alaska is actually a pretty good analogy for thinking about the relationships of power between the majority group and indigenous peoples. Alaska is also a source of energy for the mainland of the United States. And there's a similar sort of resource story here when it comes to the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs had their own state in the 1930s and 1940s. It was called East Turkestan. It was an internationally recognized republic. Pretty short-lived, and by 1949, it had been subsumed into the People's Republic of China, which is what contemporary China is called today. Initially, they were, well, and continuing into the present, they were promised autonomy. So the Uyghur region is actually called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And so you might want to think about it as something like a reservation where they are supposed to have some control over their governance. But over time, we've seen that governance structure really be sort of replaced with people that are put in positions of power that come from outside of the group. Okay, so fast forward kind of more into the present. In the 1990s, China was opening up to the West. It was becoming a market economy. And prior to this, they had been a communist state, a Maoist state. But in the 90s, China was becoming this economic powerhouse and needed to find raw materials to drive their economy. So most of the factories are in Eastern China, but they needed oil and natural gas and all of those sorts of resources that would fuel industry. And so one of the sources of that was in Northwest China, and we saw large numbers of people migrating from Eastern China to the Northwest at this time. When they arrived, they built out the hard infrastructure, the pipelines, the roads, the railways, all of the things that you'd need to extract the natural resources. And over time, they also developed industrial agriculture in the region. There had already been some in the north, where there had been a population of Han people that had moved there in the 1950s. But in the 1990s, they entered the Uyghur homeland, which is down here in the south, where 95 to 99% of the population are Uyghur. And they developed this land here in particular for cotton production. And today, around 84% of Chinese cotton comes from this region. Around 1/5 of the world's tomatoes also comes from this region. So you can see that there's some major resources that are coming out of this space. Along with the infrastructure building and industrial agriculture, the settler population also brought a service economy. They started restaurants and hotels and all of those sorts of things. And over time, they started to kind of take over the institutions of this space. So the banking system, the education system, the people in charge, and the teachers in the schools were replaced by people from outside of the region over time. It didn't happen immediately, but it was part of a sort of institutional capture. Uyghurs saw themselves really excluded from the new economy, from the resource sector in particular. They found some work in cotton production, often as sort of tenant farmers, not really in the sort of owning their labor kind of positions. They weren't the managers. And so they saw themselves really becoming impoverished relative to where they had been prior to this, because the cost of living was rising with this new economy, but they were excluded from those jobs. And so what I was working on in my initial research was studying why people were coming to the city, especially young men. What were the economic drivers behind this? And what I was finding was that they simply couldn't make a life for themselves on their farms any longer. And so they were being pushed into kind of a wage labor economy. And so in 2011, when I did my first year of field work, I was meeting all these young men who are coming from the countryside to the city. An additional element of that migration was 3G networks that arrived in 2010. And gave people a way of networking and finding out information about the city, about ways of finding jobs in the city. Everyone at that point in time were buying smartphones. This was really the first time that Uyghurs were getting online. Prior to this, you could go to in the towns, you could go to an internet cafe and you could rent some space at a computer, but mostly people just did some gaming when they did that, play computer games. Now, though, people could get on the internet in their own homes, in their villages, on their own devices. And smartphones are really intuitive. So even people that didn't have much training in computers could figure them out really quickly. There was a new app that was established at this time called WeChat, which is really similar to WhatsApp. And it allowed Uyghurs to use the oral speech function to talk to each other. Uyghur script, which is an Arabic script, wasn't of the computer designers hadn't really built a keyboard for people to use that script on the smartphones. And so using Uyghur speech allowed people to talk and use these devices without the actual typing. And it also had the effect of kind of hacking the censorship system in China, because Uyghur speech couldn't be fully assessed by the censorship apparatus. And so the oral speech function on WeChat really allowed people to communicate with each other in new ways. They started to find jobs and go to the city, but they also started to talk to teachers that were based outside of China in places like Turkey or Uzbekistan. And they talked about religion themselves on these devices. In the city, the migrants often organized themselves in mosque communities. They would find a mosque where they felt comfortable, usually because it was people that went to that mosque were from the same class background and often from the same place in rural areas in southern Xinjiang. But they said that the mosque space was not the space of real Islam. It was the space of ritual Islam, because it was, where you pray and all of that. But the teachings that they received there were censored by the government. And so they said, this isn't real Islam. Real Islam, they said, was happening on their smartphones. And mostly what they were interested in was, just normative forms of Islamic practice. They're mostly Sunni. They're in the Hanafi school of Sunni Islam. Just things like what is halal, what is haram, how should Muslims dress, those sorts of questions. They were really just discovering their place in the larger Muslim society, because they had been really cut off from other Muslims for a long time. This had some effect in how they began to carry out daily activities. Um, and so people became more pious. They started to pray more frequently. Some men started to grow beards. Women veiled themselves in ways that maybe in the past they hadn't. Although many women, Uyghur women, had veiled themselves before too. Um, in any case, there was sort of a piety movement that grew among them. And the state was really concerned by this. There had been protests from Uyghurs in the past, often having to do with labor issues or land seizures, police brutality. But around this time, there was also some new forms of violence, Uyghurs attacking Han civilians, sometimes in southern Xinjiang, but there was a couple cases outside of the region, one in a train station in Kunming, which is a city in eastern China. Over 30 people were killed by Uyghurs carrying knives, and it looked as though they were inspired by the Islamic State or something like that. And so it really kind of met international standards for what counts as terrorism. And so the state began to conflate the piety movement with those violent acts. And they declared in May 2014 the People's War on Terror. And I was living there in the region at the time, and in the neighborhoods where I was at, these posters were put up everywhere, and they outlawing certain forms of attire and behavior, saying that if you veil yourself or have a beard, you can be detained. If you have Islamic symbols on your clothing, you can also be detained. And this was really just the beginning of the People's War. It went way beyond simply targeting those that carried out criminal acts, which may have been several hundred to 1,000 or so people that were actively supporting that, and began to target the entire population of people, Muslims in this region, which is around 15 million people. So the response was not proportionate to the crime. Along with the sort of outlawing of behavior, they also began a kind of digital enclosure system, which is what a lot of my work focuses on, which is state security and private technology companies working together to really break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet. So they were very concerned that Uyghurs could use WeChat to talk fairly freely with each other. And so they needed to develop new tools to control that communication. Over time, they invested at least 8 billion, actually quite a bit more than that. This is just over 2 years, they invested $8 billion in sort of building this enclosure and control system. It's important to note that China itself is really positioning itself to be a global leader when it comes to technology. So artificial intelligence is something that the government has prioritized as a national project. They hope that by 2030, it'll bring $7 trillion in Chinese GDP, and that they will surpass some of the technology advances that American companies have. So there's 1,400 tech firms working in this space, but the largest companies, the national champions that are sort of the equivalents of Google or Facebook, they're really at the center of the project. A few of the tools that they developed over the last decade are tools to automate the transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech, making it available for censorship and control. And they've also begun a project to automate the detection of Uyghur and Kazakh faces. This is really one of the first government sort of sponsored projects to sort of automate forms of racialization, to automate profiling, so that if a Uyghur walks into a room, the cameras will detect that it's a Uyghur based on the phenotypes of their face, the shape of their eyes and their nose, all of those sorts of things. So it's actually quite disturbing that technology is being used in this way to target entire groups. To implement this system, it wasn't something that you could just design and plug in. It had to be implemented by a lot of human labor. And one of the people I interviewed recently in Kazakhstan was one of those people. He was a low-level security guard, what they call assistant police. And as I was trying to understand his role in the system, I was drawn to the work of another scholar named Lily Irani, who works in India primarily. And what she found in her work is that complex technical systems, artificial intelligence systems, often take a lot of labor, people that she calls data janitors. They're the people that that companies will hire through a platform called Mechanical Turk, which is an Amazon platform. Um, and they'll hire workers in South Asia or other places to work at really low wages to train the algorithms of the system. So this person might sit on their computer all day, pointing out objects in images to train the system to recognize those objects. This is the same sort of work that we do when we try to access a website and we have to go through one of those CAPTCHAs and identify all the traffic lights in this grid of pictures. We're also training an algorithm when we do that kind of work. So in this case, the data janitors in Northwest China become data police, people that are sorting the population and policing the data itself. In 2016 and 17, the state hired around 90,000 of these people. And Byler, the person I mentioned in the last slide, is one of those 90,000. He said that when he was hired, his first job was to work in a convenience police station, which were built throughout the region. There's almost 8,000 of these stations. And these are really surveillance hubs. They're banks of cameras or screens inside of them, and the data janitors are supposed to, or data police are supposed to watch those screens. They're responsible for a grid of the policing system, which has a number of different housing developments within it, and other things as well, like shopping malls or banks or what have you. So inside their surveillance hub, they go on a virtual patrol of the grid, going from camera to camera. And then in strategic areas like mosques or high traffic areas like transit hubs, they have automated systems that are doing face recognition of people's faces in real time, and it'll alert the data police if someone who's on a watch list shows up in those spaces. The other thing that Byler was assigned to do sometimes was to sort the population at the checkpoints of the grid. So as you move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, there's checkpoints that you go through. And there they are sorting the population by ethnicity. So they have a green lane, is what they call it, that is open for Han people, that it's just based again on the appearance of their face, that are waved through this line and not to be inconvenienced by it. So it's a kind of TSA pre-check sort of line. I went through this checkpoint in 2018, and these two lines were for Uyghurs, and this line, the green line, was for Han people. I'm not Han or Uyghur, so I asked the Uyghurs that were in the line which line I should go through, and they said, well, you're speaking Uyghur, and they might think you're Uyghur, so you should go through the Uyghur line, which is what I did. And when you get to the front, you have, if you're a Uyghur person, you have your ID scanned, and then the image taken of your face matching your face to the image on your ID. I didn't have one of those IDs, so they had to manually scan me with their phone. As you go through the metal detector and this data door, which is behind here, it's also tracking your smartphone to make sure that it's registered to the person who is carrying the ID. So it's a ways of geolocating someone in space and time, and using all of these different kinds of identifiers to assure that that person is where they are and that they are who they say they are. The other thing that the data police did, this is something that Byler said happened around 6 months into his work, like in mid-2017, is they were given these devices, which are called counterterrorism swords, which are devices that you can plug into a phone or a computer using a USB, and then it will search through the data on that device, looking for between 50,000 and 70,000 different markers of political or religious activity. So it does it very quickly, like in the space of a minute or something. It's similar to the way that antivirus software might work on your computer, where it's looking for viruses or malware. In this case, though, it's not looking for those kinds of things. It's looking for viruses of Islam. That's how they talk about it, is that Islam itself is a kind of virus. It promotes extremism. It's an ideology of hate. And that's really normalized in the government rhetoric around what they're looking for here. Byler said that after you scan someone, they would get a reading that would say that this person is safe, normal, or unsafe. And there would be a color code associated with it. People that were unsafe were people that had done some of these things. They had gone to the mosque regularly. The police documents that I reviewed said that if you go more than 200 times in a year, then you will be viewed as untrustworthy or too pious. If you wore a hijab, or here it's really looking at images of people wearing hijabs or having a beard under the age of 55, you can be detained for that. Contact with people in Muslim majority countries like Turkey or Uzbekistan also flagged. Unauthorized religious teachings or being a part of a religious study group on WeChat, which is very common. Almost every young person I was interviewing back in 2014 was doing those things. Having studied Arabic, or some of these technical things like using a VPN, which is a virtual proxy network that allows you to get outside of the Chinese internet, or installing WhatsApp or Facebook, these encrypted sort of apps that you might have on your phone and that are illegal in China. If you are determined to be untrustworthy, you would be detained and then you would be investigated further. And then from there, you would either be sent to prison, or you could also be released, but not often that people are released. Either sent to prison or you'd be sent to a camp. They were building camps around the same time. There's over 300 camps that have now been documented across the region. This is what one of them looks like from a satellite and also from the ground view. This is the largest camp in the region. Some of these buildings are actually not camp spaces or detention centers. There's factories that have been built inside here as well. And I'll get into that in a minute. These camps are not schools. The state talks about them as being training centers or re-education centers. But when we look at the government bid contracts, it's very clear that these are camps or prisons, that they have surveillance systems and razor wire, that the guards carry non-lethal weapons. They're using shackles to transfer people into these spaces. They're locked in cells for most of their time inside. It's really a kind of medium security prison. So that's a dormitory style cell with 6 or so bunk beds. There's cameras at each corner of the room, and the lights are often not turned off at any point. During the day, people are asked to sit on small stools and watch videos on a flat screen TV that's up on the wall. The videos are often political speeches and language education, Chinese language instruction videos. So it's a kind of distance learning that's supposed to be happening. Most people said that they didn't learn very much. The most that they learned was, what they could and couldn't do. They also learned sort of patriotic rhetoric, and they memorized songs, like patriotic songs, that they had to sing before they were given their meals. But most people that came out of the camps, I've interviewed around 15 people that have been in the camps, said that they really didn't learn much at all. They still can't speak Chinese beyond what they had memorized. Soon after he got his counterterrorism sword, Byler was asked one day to act as an escort to transfer detainees from a holding area, a kind of jail space, to a formal camp. And what he saw looked a lot like this. He said that the detainees they were assigned to put bags over their heads, black plastic bags. They had vests on similar to these, and they shackled their hands behind their backs. These vests here, this is in a geolocated, a verified image that was leaked from a government source in China. It says really clearly on the back of their vests that that they're coming from a jail space in close to Kashgar, in a county close to Kashgar. And this is happening in Korla, which is another city, a few hundred kilometers away. So Byler said that, he was seeing this in front of him, and he realized then kind of more fully exactly what he was involved with, that there was elderly people in their 80s, old women, and very young people, as young as 14. He recognized some of the people that were in detention as, former neighbors. He knew then that, these are not criminals and shouldn't be treated this way. Um, and here I'll just read a kind of a quote from him. He said that there was nearly 600 people waiting to be loaded into rows of buses. His job was to put shackles on their hands and feet and a black hood over their heads. We had so many manacles, Baimurat told the other three men in the room, his voice almost a whisper. This was happening in Kazakhstan at a sort of a group interview. Um, I saw very young women, very old women, and men with white beards among the detainees. All the detainees, except perhaps one or two, were Muslim. One of the old women could not walk to her leg due to a leg injury, so the police contractors dragged her to the bus. I'll never forget her screams, Murat said, placing his hand over his heart. When I witnessed this, I felt terribly bad. I regretted being a police with every fiber of my being. I was crying on the inside. As he said this, the other men, many of whom were missing loved ones in the camp, leaned in close, shaking their heads, their knees touching. And I've included some of the sort of the atmosphere of him telling this story because this was sort of a truth and reconciliation event. Because Baimurat is a perpetrator. He's a functionary in the system, someone who is, partially responsible for detaining people. And the men in the room that were around him were people who had lost people into the camps. But here they were really forgiving him and supporting him in telling this story. They weren't blaming him. And I found this to be a really kind of hopeful moment. Around mid 2018, lots of government documents and satellite imagery started to show factories being built in the camps. The state development agency said that the camps were now becoming a carrier of the economy in the same way that oil and natural gas had been and continue to be a carrier of the economy. They said that the camps are becoming a carrier because they're attracting so many companies to build factories. Many of the people that are working in these factories are doing garment manufacturing, a lot of textile related work. This is the center of Chinese cotton, this area. So it makes sense that they would locate production at the same site as the spaces where it's grown. It also has something to do with the rising cost of labor in Eastern China. Already some jobs are leaving China to go to places like Bangladesh or to Vietnam where wages are lower. It's a kind of offshoring. And here we have another kind of internal offshoring where a group of people that are devalued because of their status as Muslims are put to work in factories at very low wages and without real freedom to say no or to organize in any way. One of the people that was put to work in the factories is this woman. Her name is Gulzira Al-Khan. I interviewed her also in January of 2020, soon after she had come across the border from China into Kazakhstan. She had been, her husband had been living in Kazakhstan and had petitioned the Kazakhstani government to get her out, and Kazakhstani government had pressured China to do that. And so she's one of the few people who can really tell her story. Baimurat had a similar sort of way of getting out of China. So Gulzira was found guilty of watching Turkish TV shows where people wore hijabs. She had traveled to Kazakhstan, which is a Muslim majority country. She had a passport. She was under the age of 55. Those were all factors in how they decided that she should be detained. And she was held in a camp for around a year. It's really horrific conditions, very crowded, 30 people in a cell, often sleeping on the floor. It didn't have a toilet inside the cell, so they could only use the toilet once a day, and it was a timed, they would only allow them to have 2 minutes on the toilet. If they spent more than 2 minutes, then they would be beaten, often hit in the head with a club or a stunning device. She said that they hit them in the head so that the bruises wouldn't show, which says something about how the space of a camp allows for all kinds of abuse to happen. Even if those that are in charge of it don't want prisoners or detainees to be abused, it still is a factor. There's a real process of dehumanization that happens in this space. After she was released, they said she had passed the language exams. She went back to her village and was there for about 3 days, and then the local authorities came and said, now you're going to work in a factory. This factory was around 7 kilometers from the camp where she had been held previously, and they assigned her to work in a glove factory. When she arrived at the factory, she recognized her boss, who's this man. He's Wang Xinghua. He's from Eastern China, and had relocated parts of his factory from there to this new industrial park. And here he's speaking in a state TV interview, talking about the factory work. And he's saying that because they're aiding Xinjiang, which is how they talk about their project in poverty alleviation, they've generated 2,000 jobs. They've created 2,000 jobs for Uyghurs and Kazakhs. So it's a real benefit for the Uyghurs and Kazakhs. He's also saying that they've generated $6 million in sales in 2018, which is a lot of money. What he doesn't say in this interview is that he's only paying Gulzira and the other workers around 300 yuan per month, along with 14 or 1.5 pennies per pair of gloves. So this is around a sixth of the minimum wage. Initially, he had promised Gulzira 600 yuan, but then they cut that in half because they said they're feeding them, they're providing housing, and they also give them a weekly visit back to their home village using a company bus to transport them. So they have like an hour back with their family. He says, for all of those reasons, they feel like they can garnish their wages. Gulzira recognized Wang Xinghua because he had actually come to the camp and he had selected her to be a worker. She had seen him in the camp several times. So I'm just making that clear so you can see that there's a really direct connection between the camp and the factory. The factories that are associated with these camps are in this region, are in this global supply chain. So all of the brands that I've listed here have, at least in the past, been involved in using Uyghur labor and cotton from this region, even as recently as 2019. At least in some cases. Many of them are now trying to relocate their supply chains as they realize what's happening. But I'm just putting this here so you realize that all of us are really implicated in the system. It's not something that's just isolated to Northwest China. Gulzira's factory was set up to export gloves to Eastern Europe and Russia. So there's probably fewer of her gloves that have shown up here. Gulzira said, she's now in Kazakhstan, she told me there were checkpoints at the entrance of the walled-off dormitory and factory where her ID and face were scanned. She said, we would have our bodies and phones checked when we arrived and in the middle of the day. When we were leaving for the dormitory at the end of the day, they would check again because they were worried we might take a sewing needle. After we got to know the police contractors, we asked them, why are you still here watching us? They just laughed, never replied. The answer to this question was that the security workers were monitoring whether or not they were acting like submissive, re-educated industrial workers. Another former re-educated worker who I interviewed at the same time, a few days later, named Rebecca, told me, we just had to smile and say, yes, yes, we were like pets. Both of them are really describing a sort of system of unfreedom that extends from the camps. Gulzira was told if she refused to work, she would be sent back to the camp. So it extends from the camps into these factory spaces where digital enclosures, these checkpoints, having phones scanned, all controls people's behavior in terms of movement and also digital behavior. Okay, so I'm gonna start wrapping this up, but before I do, I want to kind of talk about some of the broader effects in Uyghur society and Kazakh society. So one of the things we've seen over the last 3 years, 4 years now, is a really rapid increase in boarding schools and kindergartens, which are actually residential schools for children. These are for the children of those that are sent to the camps and others that are being sent to work in factories. Some of the people sent to the factories don't ever go to the camp, they're just sent directly to the factory. So that means that these children are being raised in an environment where they don't speak their own language, that their language is criminalized. Islam itself is also outlawed. So they're really growing up in a non-Uyghur, non-Kazakh, non-Muslim environment. This is a view of one of those residential kindergartens. Sometimes the kids are allowed to visit family members, once a month or something like that, but it's really something similar to residential schools in North American history that were used for Native Americans, or maybe the foster care system that's, is also analogous. There's evidence that children very, very young are taken from their parents, under the ages of 6 months. This is infant care centers associated with this. And it extends all the way through the education process. So from middle school to high school, the children are also separated from their parents for significant times. It's not as though they, completely lose touch, but they might only see their family once a month or even less. We've also seen Uyghur language publication and Kazakh language publication really eliminated and erased. So lots and lots of books, hundreds of books have been outlawed. And there is still some Uyghur language publishing, but it's almost all now exclusively translations from Chinese to Uyghur. So Uyghur authors have been criminalized in many cases, and many have been sent to the camps as well. Language inside the camp space, inside the factory space, and the education system is trying to retrain these people to speak in Chinese. So what you see X'd out here or blacked off in this image is the Uyghur script in Arabic. They're trying to really reduce the use of Arabic script and instead train people to speak in Chinese. We've also seen the institutions of Uyghur and Kazakh society really being attacked. The religious space, the mosque space, was really the last remaining space of a kind of autonomy. And thousands of the lower level, sort of neighborhood level mosques have been destroyed over the last 3 or 4 years. Some of the larger mosques in the cities remain standing, but they have checkpoints at the entrances of them, which has dramatically decreased people going inside the mosques. So it's really a way of sort of criminalizing religious behavior and erasing it in some cases. One of the most troubling things that's come out of this system is the erasure of sacred landscapes. Cemeteries have been leveled and replaced with parking lots. And these grave sites are also often the site of shrines. So Uyghurs have a Sufi tradition that encourages people to do a pilgrimage to these shrine spaces. These are things that have been developed over centuries, 1,000 years or more, and now they are being just demolished. This is a way of sort of eliminating the attachment of Uyghurs to the space or their claim to their ancestry in this space. There's lots of parallels to other colonial systems that have targeted the sacred land of native peoples. All right, so what does this suggest, all of this together? Well, what we're seeing in this space is an enclosure of the commons of Uyghur society, Kazakh society. Initially it was targeting oil and natural gas and then cotton. And now it's really about capturing the labor of this population. And what I show in my book is that this should be seen as an ongoing process, part of a global process, a kind of race to the bottom to accumulate profit from people who are seen as different. Difference is really amplified and exploited in order to create conditions where resource extraction can happen. Those sorts of things. So what I'm arguing in my book is that there's a kind of co-construction of capitalism and colonialism, that there's economic profit in some ways that can be gained from the system and state power as well, while at the same time it can transform the people that are being targeted by it. So when I say colonialism, what do I mean by it? Well, really what is at the center of colonialism is three main forms of relationship. It's about possession, domination, and occupation. Colonial possession is really about attacking kind of the language system, the life world of a people, and then subtracting and replacing that system. So when we see Uyghur language being criminalized and replaced with Chinese, when we see the institutions like the mosque and the school and the banking system replaced by the people that have captured it, that's about a kind of dispossession and taking of resources from a people. Um, Domination is when those institutions are fully captured, when the language system, faith, family structure is attacked and really replaced by the governance structure and the settler society. For this to be a settler colonialism, there has to be a settler population. And there's now around 9 million or 10 million or so people that are not native to the space who have moved into it and are in positions of power. Um, and so, in a settler society, which is what we're in as well in North America, we can't really move into a post-colonial space. We should think about colonialism as ongoing, and that all of us should be invested in decolonization. We should think about the original inhabitants of the spaces that we occupy, and we should be thinking about ways that we can restore justice in those spaces. So that's, to remedy this situation, that's what would have to happen in Northwest China. The digital enclosure element of this system, which is what a lot of my work focuses on, adds a kind of an additional element to those three kinds of relationship that I've mentioned already. And that's that they start to automate and make scalable the intimate forms of enclosure that are part of this system. So just think about, like, how much you use your smartphone, how much you carry it with you every day. What do you turn to when you wake up in the morning? Probably pick up your smartphone and check your email or whatever. So if the government had access to all that information, they would know a whole lot about you, right? That's what's happening in this space. The digital technologies that people are using is being automated and assessed to determine, who this person is and to decide if they have tendencies towards religious belief. So just to summarize what I've been talking about, terror capitalism is really utilizing a new sequence in racialization. It's not the same as in North America, where we have a history of slavery and white oppression of Black people. But it is a similar dynamic. In this case, the people being racialized are Muslim and ethnic. They're marked as other, and because of this, they can be exploited for their human labor. The pretext of terrorism, that this is a war on terror, enables a kind of state of exception, which means that the normal kinds of civil protections and human protections don't apply to this population. They can really be treated with impunity. And it's enabling two kind of interlinked forms of production, two forms of capital accumulation. The first, it really has to do with data harvesting and also creating intellectual property for the technology companies to build these tools and then adapt them for other purposes. And then along with that, the technology supports a coerced labor system where the factory owners can rest assured that the people that are working for really low wages will work really hard and will not rebel, because the enclosure system will control them. They can be sent to the camp if they are not submissive workers. All of this results in a sort of system of unfreedom and a destruction of a people, which is really kind of the basic definition of crimes against humanity. And some people are talking about this as a kind of a slowly building genocide. That's a genocide in the making. We haven't seen mass death in this case yet, but there is a lot of violence. Some of it's symbolic and cultural, but others that are also physical because of the family separation and all of these other things. So I'll leave it at that. One last thing, I suppose, before I open it up for questions, is if you want to know more about the situation and you maybe want to do your own research, there's a really good website that I would recommend called the Xinjiang Documentation Project, that's based at the University of British Columbia. And really what they do there is they collect government documents, academic resources. There's a glossary of key terms. There's timelines of how all this developed. That's really done with attention to the most authoritative sources. So if you have people that are saying that this isn't true, that this is all being made up, this is a good resource for looking at the evidence, in your own on your own time and presenting it to others. It's also very good for people that want to do teaching around this. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.